You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your chewy and moist host, Abraham.
And I'm your crispy and crunchy and maybe a little bit of a hippie host, Shane.
Now, which one of those sounds more delicious? Like, let's be real, right? Nobody wants to eat me.
I mean, I think it depends on the context. Brownies that are chewy and moist are, that's where it's at.
Oh, that's fair. And that is essentially a big part of what we're going to actually be tackling when we talk about this. First, I should let everyone know we're a psychology podcast. We talk all things psychology and human behavior and animal behavior related. Today, we get to talk about food.
I love food. This is like one of my favorite things to talk about ever.
I know. Everybody loves food. Most people love food. So I think we'll have some fun getting to talk about this. And before we do that, just want to remind you that if you would like to support the show and get some like bonus stuff, you can join us on Patreon. It's a growing community of awesome people. Mm-hmm. You can head over to patreon.com/WWD podcast. We're really trying to fit as many syllables into that handle as we possibly could. And I think that we've succeeded.
Yeah, we've done a good job.
Yeah. Other thing is that we have a merch store up and running right now. At the time that we're recording this, we have some mugs. We have some stickers. We're about to put up some shirts. We're just going to keep expanding it. So if you would like to support the show and get some practical use out of supporting the show, you get some merch stuff, head over to that store and celebrate Easter with some Why We Do What We Do merch. Because why not?
You can put your communion wine in the Why We Do What We Do mug, right? That's not sacrilegious at all.
So just also a quick celebration, shout out sort of thing. Uh-huh. There's a couple of things to acknowledge in April. One is that this is Prevent Child Abuse Month. We talked about this last year. You can go to preventchildabuse.org to learn more about that. And also, April is Autism Awareness Month. Mm-hmm. And there are lots of places you can go learn about that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, as I said, we are talking about food, but we're talking about a specific type of food. We are talking about why humans love that crunchy texture in our food. Also, what do we mean when we call something crispy or crunchy? Mm-hmm. And whether this is, in fact, universally true of humans.
Yeah, and we're also going to briefly revisit the sound of the crunch for the user and the listener. So we're going to talk about what that looks like, give some examples of that and whatnot, and be able to kind of really illustrate through painting with sound what we're talking about here.
And we're taking a journey through history and exploring the most recent research as well behind why we need the crunch.
I love so much that there is research on this. Like, this is one of my favorite things. Like, when we put together topics for the show, every now and again, a topic will come up and we'll kind of go, well, that's interesting. Let's look at that. And then we find that there's an entire body of research around a topic that shouldn't make any sense, or it seems like it's pretty kind of very specific or niche. So I'm really glad there's actually research on this.
Yeah, there's actually a couple of fields that this is largely what they do, like fields of study, which also surprised me. And I have a little bit of information about that toward the end of this discussion as well. So
cool.
Anyway, let's get into some background of talking about crispy and crunchiness.
Yeah, so crispy and crunchy are actually used somewhat interchangeably when we talk about and describe food and different textures and whatnot. And some have attempted to distinguish crispy as more of a wet sound that you might associate with an apple, celery, or other fresh produce, whereas crunchy might be more associated with sounds of biting dry foods such as chips, toast, corn nuts, stuff like that.
Yeah. Either crispy or crunchy, whatever you're using, that refers essentially to the rigidity of the food, whatever it is that you're crunching into, and the amount of force required to break the structure of that food. And to some extent, and we'll talk about a caveat to this, but to some extent, the sound produced by biting into crunchy or crispy food.
Yeah, so as a fair warning, you're probably going to get very hungry listening to this episode or seriously grossed out for our misophonia folks. So just kind of a heads up on that, because we are going to be hearing sounds as we go forward.
Yeah, exactly. We will play a few sound clips of crunchy and crispy foods. We're going to play them being simply snapped as well as being bitten into. I'm going to omit any additional masticating sounds, and I'll warn you again before we play them, but just want to let everybody know that they are in the episode that we're going to be talking about today. So if that's something you absolutely are unwilling to hear and unwilling to skip, then this might be a tough episode to listen to.
We don't want this to be an unpleasant listening experience.
Right. But we also wanted to demonstrate what we mean by some of the concepts that we're talking about.
100%.
So yeah, I got the idea for this episode when I noticed how often people would talk about or would comment on the crunch of food and often how important that was to them specifically. This one time, my brother really confused me when he was telling me that he was putting potato chips on his quesadilla. And I was like, what are you doing to your food? I had heard of people putting potato chips on their sandwich to give it a crunch. Also something I don't and haven't done, although maybe I'm missing out.
You are.
Okay, fair enough. I've never really paid attention to it before, but I also feel the crave for the crunch in my food. I really look for it and I enjoy it.
Yeah, me too. You are definitely missing out on putting potato chips on your sandwich. No, when I was growing up, people are going to go, oh, God, like, what's wrong with you when they hear this? My parents wouldn't buy crunchy peanut butter. They would always buy smooth peanut butter. So my peanut butter and jelly sandwiches never had
Incorrect.
crunch. I agree. And I've told them that since then. I was like, you've ruined my childhood. So I used to put Doritos on my peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So it was smooth peanut butter, grape jelly, and cheese, nacho cheese Doritos on the same sandwich. And let me tell you, I don't know why, but it works. That's also very 90s, I think.
That does feel very 90s. If I'm going to, let's just say, some restaurant chain that has a billion locations and everybody knows what I'm talking about, and I were to just get a regular sandwich, what kind of chips would you recommend I put on it to give this a try?
So I think just basic Lay's work well enough because they are not going to overwhelm the flavor of the sandwich and stuff like that. It'll add a little bit of salt and whatnot. But if you really want to kind of like, you know, party hard, kettle chips are really good for that. And if you want to like spice it up, maybe some jalapeno kettle chips.
Oh, all right. Jalapeno kettle chips. All right. I like this. Cool.
Yeah.
You know, I was just thinking about like other things that the crunchy foods that I personally love. Popcorn is high up there for me. Mm-hmm. And just thinking about other places where I've added, you know, to give something crunchiness is salads, those like little like tortilla strips.
Yeah.
I really like those.
You know, for me, you know, stuff like croutons always come up. I think about croutons and salads and stuff like that.
Makes a lot of sense.
You know, I prefer my vegan bacon to be crispy. I do like putting Bacos on sandwiches. Like if I do like a, you know, bacon mayonnaise type of thing on there, I'll put some Bacos on there because it adds a nice crunch.
Sure.
I think there's a lot of different ways to do this. I prefer a crispier crust with my pizza. Not a thin crust, but like I like my crust to have like a little bit of a crispiness to it, not too soft because I don't want to eat just a loaf of bread.
Fair enough. Yeah. Yeah. Like I could just buy a slice of bread and put some tomato sauce on it.
Yeah.
Call that a pizza.
Yeah. Which is just sad.
No, thank you. Yeah. So, okay. Established. We're hungry and we love crunchy food.
Yes. 100%.
So this got us thinking, talking about why this is important to everybody. What is going on psychologically that would have humans have such a love for crunchy food?
And it may seem obvious, you know, or you may be thinking, we just do. It's just something pleasurable that doesn't need explanation. You might also kind of think about, you know, maybe you were as curious as we were, you know, thinking about kind of asking the question of like, when we started talking about crunchiness, you're like, well, I wonder now too. Maybe you weren't curious until we brought it up. I certainly wasn't until Abraham was like, what is crunchiness? And I was like, oh, that's a good question. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I immediately got curious as a result of that question.
Well, wherever you are, I think we'll have some fun unpacking what is going on with crunchy food, what is happening or why it is that we enjoy the crunch and seek it out and that sort of thing. And it's interesting because it's maybe not something that you thought of before, and it might not also be super intuitive, but we have a few things to unpack with this. So let's start by defining what is a crunch.
But before we do that, should we hear an ad from our sponsors?
We definitely should. All right, and we're back. Hopefully you just heard an ad for potato chips or popcorn or something, but we're going to define what is the crunch.
Yeah, so an article from ScienceABC.com illustrated that the process of the crunch is pretty interesting. They described it as, it's like biting into glass.
Yeah, I thought that was a weird metaphor to use.
Yeah, there are very few people that do that.
And they specifically recommend not doing it, but let's not use their metaphor. Essentially, what they point out in the article that I think is more relatable is that the crunch is when we bite into something and we first meet resistance. Then with additional force applied, the built-up force shatters the resisting structure of the thing that we're biting into. And that's why they use the glass metaphor. But if you can instead think of food, and we'll go with, for example, maybe a potato chip, that just like letting your teeth land on it may not be enough pressure to actually break that chip, but you push a little harder, and then eventually the structure will just crack.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. So we think about this in a couple different ways too. If the bite happens to fruit, vegetable, or a wet crunch food, you're most likely to be breaking the cell walls that releases potential energy, right? So biting into the skin of something will release a pop. And this energy also vibrates the air in the creation of an acoustical snap or crunch sound. That's why we hear that when you bite into celery, you bite through the skin of an apple, you bite into a carrot, all of those sounds, there's a lot of potential energy being released as a result of that bite.
Exactly. And when the bite happens to dry, crunchy food, then essentially you're just breaking apart these rigid structures, usually a starch or protein, filled with pockets of air that essentially accumulated as the food was being prepared. And the resulting shattered structure, again, vibrates the air in a similar auditory way, although, as some have argued, distinct from fruits and vegetables. And actually, I think we should try this now. So we're going to play some very short biting sounds. I'm going to play 4 sounds for Shane and have him guess what the bite sound is. Okay, so this first sound, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the sound of the food snapping, and I want you to tell me if it's a wet snap or a dry snap, and then see if you can tell me what food it is.
So it sounds wet. Was it like a pear or an apple or something like that?
Yes, this is an apple. So all right. Warning for everybody listening, like the next 3 seconds, this is going to be a sound of biting into an apple. All right, I'm going to start by playing the snap. So here's that. All right, what do you think? Wet or dry sound?
That was definitely a dry sound. It sounded like you caught me in my car eating maybe some barbecue kettle chips.
It was Shane's breakfast.
Ha! Yes.
Perfect. All right, yep. This is a sound biting into it. And yeah, that is a potato chip. Great job. Then let's do another one. So here is the sound of the snap. All right. Wet sound or dry sound?
So that was a dry sound.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounded like you were eating like popcorn or like a Cheez-It or like a puff, like some kind of puff.
Yeah. These are these like these hippies, like chickpea puff things that I really like.
I love it. Those are so good.
Yeah, I really like them. Here's the sound of biting into that. All right, here is our last sound. So we'll start with just the snap. All right, wet sound or dry sound?
That is a wet sound?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna bite into it, see if you can guess what food it is. All right, what does that sound like to you?
My immediate thought is going, it's a carrot. But celery, right?
Yes, yeah. A little bit more fibers than the carrot to crunch through, but impressive. Yeah, I think that there is some evidence here, if you can call it evidence, that there does seem to be a difference between wet and dry sound. So maybe this scientist was right.
Yeah, there is like a quality to it that I think that's difficult to quantify, but there is like a quality to it when you do hear it. Like there are like descriptors that you could use to kind of convey what that sound is actually like.
Yeah. And now when we're biting into food, there are a myriad of experiences that we have. There's the texture, the various flavors, the aroma, our expectations about what we're about to eat, the visual presentation of the food, the atmosphere and the context in which we are eating, and the sound of the food as it's being chewed and masticated. All of these participate in the experience and joy of crunchiness of our food. And we'll talk a little bit more about people who don't necessarily have equal access to all of those senses. But just for now, why do those things matter when we're talking about why we like crunchiness?
Okay, so we're going to go over a couple different reasons. And the first, while it's not necessarily the first, it's the first one we're going to discuss, we had to put these in order. And that's why this one comes up first. Now, first is the idea that the crunchiness of our food tells us something about the quality, namely that it's fresh. Fresh food usually has a better snap or a crunch than something that's maybe wilted or dry, or like maybe like not as fresh.
This is actually something that was really consistent in some of the research that I found in preparing for this, is this idea that crunchiness implies freshness. So Dr. Zeta Vickers, the director of undergraduate studies in food science at the University of Minnesota, this is one of these fields I was telling you about, where you have someone who is essentially doing their research in auditory processes involved in food. And so she reported that crispiness is a more high-pitched sound, and this includes wet food such as kale, whereas lower pitched sounds are the more crunchiness, such as something like an almond, or as we described, a chip or something.
Honestly, it's about that straightforward. So crunchiness and crispiness are highly salient features of food that are strongly associated with quality, safety, and freshness. It is one of the most universally beloved qualities a food can have. But real quick, Abraham, what does the word salient mean?
Well, you said it. I feel like you should have to define it, but that's okay.
Okay, you're right. I tried to get out of that. Let me see. I will pull this up. Hold on. I will describe salient. So the word salient means that it is most noticeable or important. So these sounds tend to be a highly noticeable sound or highly noticeable quality. Crispiness and crunchiness, they're very highly noticeable when it comes to foods like this. We definitely pick up on it really quickly when we bite into something.
I like to think of it as something that's very obvious or very clear. That's what salient is.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so Dr. Vickers conducted a study in which crispy and crunchy food sounds, that she was essentially looking at the people's their reported relation to it in terms of whether they found it positive or negative, and that the crispy, crunchy food sounds had the largest positive correlation with pleasantness of food, as reported by 52 subjects that were in that study.
Yeah, and an older study by Szczesniak,
I'm guessing. So just for the people listening, and you can see this in the notes, but there are 4 consonants back to back. 2 of them are Z's in this person's name.
Yes, it's spelled S-Z-C-Z-E-S-N-I-A-K. I would hazard a guess that it's Szczesniak.
Yeah.
But if I'm wrong, please correct me, because I don't want to be horribly wrong and let that continue into the ether.
I think it's a good guess.
I feel like it's educated on some level.
Yeah.
Now, this older study showed that in a word association test, participants largely only recognize crunchiness or crispiness as important textural qualities of food, at least as important as the flavor. So they found that flavor was important, but so was this kind of firmness, toughness, crispiness, crunchiness that goes along with certain foods.
Yeah, actually. So they were given a whole list of words, and they didn't even... almost none of the other words did they even use in their word association test. They really only recognized crispy and crunchiness, again, aside from flavor, as the important textural qualities of food. Yeah. Now, there is the sort of piece of this in talking about why we might like crunchiness. Now, we're talking essentially about this first hypothesis, which is that it's fresh. And from an evolutionary perspective, it is conceptually consistent that we would quickly learn to associate foods that are fresher and have not started, as you sort of said, wilting or going bad because they're growing fungus or harmful bacteria. We would have associated that crunchy sound they make when we bite into them with that quality, that freshness, and that they don't have those bad things growing on them. However, it is also important to consider that the foods that would have been available that were crunchy back when we're, thinking evolutionarily speaking over the history of our species and the species that came before us, that the foods that were crunchy were actually more of the less palatable foods. Crunchy foods would have included insects, tough plant matter that was difficult to digest and not particularly tasty. Thus, the idea that we're naturally drawn to crunchiness is probably not correct. Instead, it is that we learn it very quickly and very easily, as when we are now living in a world in which crunchiness and crispiness are more readily available. And so this is unlikely to be something that really was selected for by evolution.
Yeah. Now, a common name in this field, Dr. Charles Spence, stated that, quote, "We're not born liking noisy foods. Noise doesn't give a benefit in terms of nutrition," end quote. And you can make the argument, too, that if we are a species that has very little of natural defenses, we probably don't want to make a whole lot of noise because we might want to have more stealth. So I can't imagine eating noisy foods at a period of time would be helpful. I harken back to that Family Guy episode where Peter is in the attic with Anne Frank and he starts eating chips and they're noisy and that's how they get caught. Like, I think about that, like noise doesn't allow for stealth too. And there's probably like an evolutionary benefit to being quiet.
Right. That you might either scare away future food or you might attract predators to yourself. There are reasons not to go for the crunchy food. Now, there are essentially two things that really happened, though, that made crunchy food start to have more of an association with the quality and like the things we want to go for. One, as one article pointed out, is just fire. That once we started cooking our food, it became crunchier and we started to associate that sort of those textures, those flavors, that sound, and etc., the feeling of crunchiness with food that was safe to eat and tasted good. And then following from that and similar to that is that once we started mass manufacturing foodstuffs, we started learning these other new associations with crunchiness. That's foods that are cooked in oils that are crunchy and they're fatty.
Yum.
So they're delicious. Those are kind of two major things that happened that started changing the way that food was available to us in such a way that we would start to experience crunchiness as being a good indicator of good quality.
Yeah. So crunchiness is therefore also associated with other highly desirable traits of food, which is that sweet, fat content that we love to taste so much of. You know, it gets associated with those things. Like you think about all the cereals you like, typically people are not going for the Wheaties. They're going for the, the Cocoa Puffs and stuff like that are also crispy and crunchy, but there's different associations there. Now, nutrient-dense foods tend to be pretty rewarding to us, and many argue because these would have been highly valuable foods in times of scarcity, most of human history. They would provide a lot of nutritional bang for your buck if a human had been so lucky as to happen upon some highly fatty food. So that's why this crunchiness piece is so important.
Exactly right. So let's imagine some examples just to like really highlight the sort of freshness angle here. If you imagine a crispy apple versus a soft apple, such as a Red Delicious, anyone?
Yeah, no thanks.
Yeah, exactly. Or a crispy celery versus squishy celery.
Ugh.
I know, right? We got crunchy cereal versus soggy cereal.
Yeah, no thanks.
A crunchy walnut versus a soft walnut.
Right.
If you got crispy salad greens versus limp, wet salad greens.
Yeah, nobody likes a limp salad.
No one likes like a limp, no. Even something like a pineapple. Like, if you were to bind up, now obviously pineapples are soft, but you imagine the difference between like a little bit of a crunchier pineapple chunk versus like a mushy pineapple chunk.
Yeah, I would much rather eat fresh pineapple because it's got a little bit of resistance and push to it versus like canned pineapple, which is definitely going to be softer and easier to chew.
Yeah.
That's kind of the example that I look at there. And I think there's a lot of different examples of that for all kinds of foods. Now, there are times where softer foods might be more palatable. Like, I definitely don't want a crispy cake.
Yeah.
I would prefer like a softer, moist cake,
Right.
I don't want I guess, to be fair, it depends on the kind of pretzel, but I think a soft pretzel would be cool. But I still like, if it's wet or like sagging, I want it to have a little bit of like, a little bit of resistance to it. So there's a lot of nuance within this, but for the most part, we want it to have that little bit of crunchiness, crispiness, toughness, like rigidity to it to kind of signal that it's a little bit fresher than something else.
Yeah, and they give quite a few examples because I mean, like if you imagine if you leave an orange out and it starts to dry out, it will become crunchy and it will be pretty gross. And if I order something that comes with crunchy mustard, then I send it back.
Yeah, no thanks.
Yeah, not dealing with the crunchy mustard.
I'm not trying to eat mustard flakes.
Yeah. So most food we prefer to be crunchy because crunchiness and crispiness is associated with freshness. And also now with that, it's associated with that delicious fattiness. But there are definitely going to be exceptions to that. But we do really enjoy that fresh crunchiness in our food.
Yes. And as a quick side note, why we do what we do is a pro crunchy peanut butter podcast.
Absolutely.
We always have been and always will be.
Correct.
That's how you know that we're kidnapped. If either of us are recording the podcast and we're like, man, smooth peanut butter is really cool, then you know that we're you need to call for help.
That's going to be our safe code word from now on. That if we ever talk about the great qualities of smooth peanut butter, you know that we're being held hostage somewhere.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I love peanut butter in general, and we'll eat all the peanut butter ever. But like, definitely prefer crunchy peanut butter.
That's very fair. All right, well, let's go get some smooth peanut or some crunchy peanut butter. Not smooth peanut butter. We're okay.
We need
help.
We're
going to get some crunchy peanut, and we're gonna chew on that, and then we're gonna come right back with our teeth sticking together and talk about the next reason we might prefer crunchy food after some people try and tell you stuff. Okay, so we were just extolling the virtues of peanut butter. I got a few gooey, delicious, crunchy textures still left in my mouth. That's going to definitely aid in the quality of my voice moving forward. We're talking about crunchiness and the second hypothesis that is offered as to why people like crunchy food. And the second reason is because the crunch brings variety to the textures of our food.
Yeah, so although we tend to enjoy a lot of different crunchy foods, it doesn't mean that we are only eating crunchy food. And furthermore, we can have those varieties of crunchiness for bonus texture variety. And I think of, sandwiches that I've eaten and stuff like that, where it's like, it's nice to have a little bit of a variety of those textures on that particular bite.
And you can have different types of crunchiness. So like we want a crunchy wonton strip on our crunchy salad. That gives us both the dry crunch and the wet crunch on the sandwich that you mentioned.
So a meat and cheese sandwich is a choir of soft food, soft bread, soft spread. I like that rhymes, by the way.
Thank you.
Soft bread, soft spread, soft meat, soft cheese. And people adding lettuce or other greens, sometimes apples or potato chips, like we said, to augment their sandwich game with some variable texture. It really makes a difference. And so that's why people like to add all those different things. Besides flavor, there is like a little bit of a change to that texture and shape. I mean, I think of like egg salad sandwiches. Mm-hmm. Most of the time they're very, very soft. But if you put like crispy bacon on it or like, vegan bacon or something like that, it's a nice little change up.
Yeah, exactly. That's well said. Of course, there are some foods that would be alarming if they're crunchy. A crunchy piece of deli meat may be very dry or have something else terribly wrong with it. A crunchy swig of milk would certainly raise some red flags and also probably raise some stomach contents, which actually also does bring us to our next important point of why we like crunchy food, and that is expectations.
Yes, because of our associations, each piece of food stuff we encounter that we have experience with will subtly cue us to prepare for certain textures and flavors. And the more experiences that we gain, the more we begin to generalize those expectations to novel foods until we start predicting how much we are going to like a food based on extremely little information, sometimes only a picture, a description, or even just a name. There is nothing worse than eating something or drinking something with an expectation and it being entirely different than what you expect.
Oh yeah.
Like I've gone to take a swig of water and it's Sprite and I'm like, wow, something like that. And it's like, right. I won't expect it. Even though I like Sprite, I just don't expect it.
Exactly. Yes. If we're expecting something to have the crunch and instead we get a squish, we're often very and understandably repulsed.
I'm repulsed by that sentence.
Right.
Bums
exactly.
me out so much right there.
And I mean, similarly, if you expect to bite into something squishy and instead you get a crunch, we are also likely to be repulsed or at the very least surprised. You're like, yes. Oh, I've got this nice pudding right here. Crunch, that would definitely be surprising.
I didn't ask for pudding chips. So, we crave the crunch because the food we are used to eating has a crunch. Even new foods that have similar characteristics to food that we know will give us certain expectations about features of that food. So if we see something that is, bagged like a chip, it looks like a chip, it's marketed like a chip, we're probably going to expect it has the same texture as a chip. And so that's, I think, really important to remember as we enter trying new foods in different ways.
It's as they say, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck,
it's probably crunchy.
It's probably crunchy. Because we have these positive associations with crunchiness, we can sort of create those expectations by describing our food in such a way, or even naming our food in such a way that it starts to prepare the consumer, the literal consumer in this case, to expect that crunch. And so we'll describe a food that you've never had before. I'm going to tell you that it has these like crispy, crunchy textures. I might say something like, blackened bacon strip or toasted bread. All of those things are going to tell you something about what to expect with when you bite into the food that now you're looking for the crunch.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, the word fried alone is enough to create an expectation of crispiness. Fried plantains, fried bacon, fried chicken, that all has a certain expectation. What's interesting about that, though, is like I've had fried eggs. They are not crispy.
That's a fair point.
Not normally.
Yeah.
Typically, the word fried implies, especially in the South, that something will be crispy, crunchy, and probably very, very heavy on your stomach.
Yes. Yeah. It'll result in multiple bathroom trips.
Yes.
But hey, you can actually really leverage the words that we use by calling something like, let's go back to fried chicken. Now I can call it crispy fried chicken. And now your mouth is really watering, non-vegetarian people out there.
Absolutely.
Vegetarians heaving a little bit. But anyway, yeah, you just add that little word in front of the description or the name of the food that you're preparing, and you've elevated its appeal to the consumers.
So even experienced food advertisers and layperson consumers are very well aware of the importance of the name of a product. Apparently we weren't when we gave this podcast the 7 syllables title and 16 syllable initials. We were not good with names at that time. And that might be why we're still grow millions of pounds of red delicious apples per year, even though they are only one of those things. They are definitely red, not so delicious.
Yeah.
And definitely an affront to both food and taste. If we are pro crunchy peanut butter or we are anti red delicious apple specifically.
I'm not sure that there's enough peanut butter that could save a slice of red delicious apple and make it palatable.
No, apple shouldn't be mealy.
Right, yeah. You're biting into something that sounds like it was supposed to be an imitation of an apple, but made of cornmeal and left out a little bit too long.
Yeah, it's the uncanny valley of apples.
I love that, the description. But why wouldn't you just grab a better apple? Like go with a Honeycrisp or something.
Go with any better apple than it. Any better. I hate Granny Smith apples, and I would rather eat that than a Red Delicious.
That's very fair. I've gone through waves of phases with Granny Smith because like sometimes the tartness is just so good, but I also am like so rarely going to seek it out.
Yeah.
Speaking of apples, though, a team at Washington State University spent about a year and a half. We're talking 18 months just coming up with a name for an apple that they were cultivating. Now, they did spend 20 years cultivating this new variety, but then they spent this 18 months just trying to come up with a name for it. They wanted the name to reflect something about either the flavors, the appearance. They were looking at how familiar the words are that people will recognize, the general profile appeal of the name relative to the apple, and even how appealing the name would be at different times of year. So like, we don't want to call it something that seems like it's seasonally specific.
Right.
We want it to be universally relevant. And so they came up with the name Cosmic Crisp. So you can already see the words in there. Yep. The name itself is selling the product.
From what we understand, it's the best apple too. Like it's supposed to be amazing. I have not had it myself, but I believe Abraham has and loves it.
Yes. So my favorite apple before the Cosmic Crisp was the Honeycrisp. Mm-hmm. And now the Honeycrisp has been dethroned, although I still love Honeycrisp apples and would gladly have a Honeycrisp apple. The Cosmic Crisp is so good. I could spend the rest of this episode talking about the wonderful Cosmic Crisp apple. Now, it has one downside, which is that it looks similar to a Red Delicious. So if you can get over the visual presentation of it looking like a Red Delicious, it's not exactly like it. It doesn't have like quite the weird amorphous sort of Red Hulk look of a Red Delicious apple.
Yeah.
But it's like large and it's mostly red. But it's super crunchy or like really crispy. It's like really juicy. It is just such a good apple. So
I love that.
Can't recommend it highly enough.
In episode recommendations. I love it.
That's right.
The last thing we want to kind of touch on when it comes to this idea of crispiness and crunchiness is the idea of sensory experiences. Many sources specifically speak to the sound component of eating crunchy food. They extol the beautiful cacophony of sounds produced by a nice, loud, crispy, crunchy food. It is so varied. It is so wonderful. There's something very satisfying about something breaking in your mouth.
Right. And they even mentioned it being sort of cathartic in a way. They're like, you just want to destroy something and food is where it's at. And the sound of the crunch as one of the sensory features that accompanies texture, smell, visual presentation, and of course, flavor is hailed as one of the most important features of why we enjoy crunchy food.
There are positive associations that we build with crunchiness, and they are accompanied by all of those features, and therefore each of them becomes a new signal, nay, beacons of the joy and the experience of crunchy food. So we also endorse, crunchiness as a food thing that we enjoy.
Yeah. I mean, if you're going to endorse crunchy peanut butter, then, speaking of which, crunchy peanut butter on a Cosmic Crisp apple is super good.
Yeah, that's good to know. So I mean, like we're just layering on the recommendations as we go here.
Yeah, I feel like I know what I'm doing for lunch today. All right. So we were talking a lot about the fact that when we experience these foods, it builds essentially a bunch of expectations. They form a bunch of cues. Think back to what we've learned from Pavlov's dogs. the sounds and textures are inextricably linked to the crunch, and that the sound and that texture becomes a conditioned stimulus that elicits all the joy and the mouth juices that are part of an enjoyable crunchy experience. That those essentially are training our body to respond to and be prepared to receive all of the greatness that comes with and is associated with food that also have crunchy texture, which is going to be the flavors and the taste and all that I've sort of mentioned already.
Yeah, I imagine that there's some listeners out there that are listening to this and probably salivating just at the thought of the sound.
Yeah.
They're having the thought of the sound of the good food they like, and they're probably salivating to that. So we are becoming like a higher order conditioned stimulus in this moment.
They're pressing on the gas pedal to speed to wherever they're going so they can get to the crunchy food faster.
Yeah, does that make us conditioned listeners?
Maybe.
I don't want to get into all that. That made my brain bleed when we did that whole unit in my classes. All right, some experts point out that we actually start to habituate to the flavors of the crunchy food, and sometimes it is the sounds that maintain the enjoyment of the crunchy food. So we might actually not enjoy the taste of the food anymore. It's the sound and the crunchiness that we actually attend to more than anything else.
Well, yeah, and specifically they point out that we often become distracted when we eat, and the noisiness of our food can bring our attention back to the food where we now once again savor the wonderful qualities of our nourishment and not be distracted. You know, when you're on your phone pretending to watch what's on the TV and eating your food, you're like, there's so much else going on. Sometimes we forget to stop and enjoy the food that we're eating. And so their argument here is that the textures and the sound of the crunch can be like, oh, I've got something going on in my mouth right now that I'm actually trying to eat that's going to keep me alive and hopefully make me healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we were researching this stuff, though, we did start to feel that with all the emphasis on sound, it started to seem ableist with respect to the deaf community. So what we did was we pulled a little bit of information from the deaf community, from deaf message boards, and from kind of the community that was speaking about this to see what they had to say about the sound emphasis of this discussion. And what was really great is that they pointed out that it is absurd, our words, not theirs, to believe that they don't enjoy crunchy food just because the sound isn't there. There's still the texture and all the other aspects of the crunch that they come to love just like anyone else.
Absolutely. So I feel like maybe it's not worth emphasizing sound as being like the critical thing, but for people who have the hearing people, they're going to experience that will be part of their enjoyment of the food. The people who don't have hearing are just not going to experience the sound, and they're going to enjoy the food also and the crunchiness of the food specifically. So let's just be sensitive to the fact that we want to consider that there's a lot of people out there in the deaf community, and that why wouldn't they also like crunchy food, right?
I think I always think of it as like sound is helpful, but it's not necessary.
Yeah, I like that. Absolutely. And so I do think that's why it's more appropriate to maybe appeal to, rather than say the sound, is just the sensory experiences that come with the crunch that may or may not include sound depending on where you're at. But those sensory experiences are the feature of why we like the crunch.
Yeah.
That is sort of related to other things we've described as well.
Absolutely. So now, as a counterpoint, the sound may actually be the worst part of the crunchy food if you're one of our misophonia friends. So let's go ahead and make sure that we loop those folks in here. But before we do that, there are some more sounds from people that are trying to get money from you for a little bit. And we're back. And hopefully, maybe you bought something from the people that were just talking to you. Maybe not. We'd rather you spend your money with us, but if you spend money there too, it's your money and freedom, and we believe in liberty. So let's talk about our idea, this idea of misophonia. We did a deep dive on this on episode 220, which were released in July of 2021. It's only a little ways back, but it is worth kind of checking out if you want to understand more about this particular topic.
Now, interestingly, there was a source that I found that was, I think they were interviewing this Dr. Natan Bauman. And he pointed out that people suffering from misophonia are not bothered by their own crunching and chewing sounds, which is a question I had about it, like whether this is just universally any crunching, chewing sounds, or if it was from other people. And according to Dr. Bauman, it's everyone else's chewing, chomping, and crunching that is problematic for the person suffering misophonia, but not themselves.
Furthermore, the sounds are not consistently problematic. Certain people or contexts are much more triggering than others, so it really depends on experiences with the noise, the type of noise, the context of the noise, who's making the noise, and stuff like that.
And so Dr. Bauman also suggests of how this might develop. And he says that misophonia for these mouth sounds from others are really formed from negative experiences with those sounds. And it compounds from something sort of maybe mildly or less bothersome to something extremely irritating. So essentially the idea here being that the context in which we experience those sounds, if it's really unpleasant and we're like listening to somebody else chew, that at first we just notice is like, oh, I hate everything about this situation. Everything's terrible. And there happens to be this chewing sound. And the next time you're around loud chewing, you're like, wow, that sound is awful. And it kind of snowballs from there. Now, that's just a way that this could arise, but that's a way that he suggested in this interview.
And that makes perfect sense, right? Like learning through experience, you're probably not born hating certain sounds, but,
right.
Maybe certain sounds are like too loud or dangerous,
Right, yeah. Well, and it goes right back to the point that because even like crunchy food's not something we're born necessarily having a preference for. Mm-hmm. And specifically talking about those misophonia peeps is that it's not consistent. Like sometimes that sound will be really difficult to hear and sometimes it's much less difficult to hear. And it just depends on the context, the setting, sort of where they're at emotionally in the moment, the person who's making the sounds, etc. So that also speaks to the fact that it's not like a genetic thing specifically.
Absolutely. Now, unsurprisingly, there is a misophonia subreddit. Just like I feel like there's a subreddit for literally everything. So if you can't find a subreddit for something, you're probably very, very way too specific. But on the misophonia subreddit, you can find out where and how people with misophonia vent their frustrations. You can see a lot of what they have concerns with. There's a lot of popcorn and chip hating going on there. There's no judgment. Just saying.
Yep.
It's just kind of an objective observation of that particular subreddit.
Yeah. If you were looking for a place to talk about the person who's sitting next to you on your morning commute, chomping their way through a crunchy bag of something, that there is an outlet for that.
Absolutely.
I do have some sort of fun, interesting tidbits in here as well. One is that these different fields that I found that I had not heard these names before. And so the study of food and culture, fine cuisine, cooking styles, and what you might call the science of good eating. So what people think of as being good and how they rate it. That's called gastronomy. And a person who is a researcher in that field would then be called a gastronomist.
Ooh.
So I thought that was kind of fun.
I like that. So now there is a closely related field that combines gastronomy and psychophysics. It's called gastrophysics. Why not gastropsycho or psychonomy? I feel like psychonomy would be like psychology and economy, or maybe it's like fake money, psychonomy, boom. No money for you.
Yeah.
Gastrophysics is a scientific discipline that examines our subjective experience of eating and our surroundings and other experiences.
And also has some very sort of haughty sounding names.
Yeah, it's so fancy.
Like I said, gastrophysics sounds very professional and very scientific.
It does. I like it.
Is what it is. Another thing that I found, just unrelated to that, but interesting tidbit, is the sound of a crunching potato chip. I found an audiologist who suggested that a crunching potato chip is about 25 to 35 decibels. And this is about the level of a whisper and actually quieter than like a moderate rainfall. So that seems pretty quiet to me. Some others claim instead that crunch can be loud as 55 decibels when chewing with our mouths closed, or even as high as 63 decibels when chewing with our mouths open. And as a frame of reference for that, conversational volume is about 60 decibels. And so that actually seems pretty likely to me if chips could drown out, like if you're crunching on chips to yourself, mouth agape and just letting the world see it happen, then you actually might have trouble hearing someone talking at you. So at least for yourself, it's that loud. Whether or not it stays that loud as it crosses the room or, whatever distance is between you and your talking partners, that sound is likely going to diminish. But it does seem like it gets pretty loud.
My daughter chews with her mouth open sometimes, and it is very loud. So yeah, it's like, it's very much so like she goes to bite the chip and it's just like,
right.
You're like, what are you doing? Like, how did you make that much noise with one potato chip? Like, it's really impressive. Now, apparently in the 1980s, Frito-Lay funded an experiment to determine the ideal amount of pressure needed to crunch a chip for optimum satisfaction. They used $40,000 chewing simulators to determine a mere 4 pounds per square inch is the perfect amount of pressure needed for the maximum satisfaction while crunching. This is less than is needed to bite through most soft foods, incidentally. They gave 150 to 200 PSI for a steak as an example. So So 4 pounds per square inch is what we need for chips, though.
Yeah, 4 pounds versus that 150 or 200 pounds. So they are not difficult to eat. And they specifically even noted that once you get about beyond that, it starts to feel too tough and unpleasant and people don't like it as much. So what we like is a soft crunch, essentially. Or, I mean, soft-ish.
It's crispy.
Yeah.
It's crispy enough.
They know what they're doing.
Uh-huh.
In the same article, the writer of that article relayed a story in which an ice cream manufacturer changed its chocolate covering recipe for ice cream bars because people complained that the coating on the ice cream bars would melt off really easily and it'd be like dripping on things. It's on their clothes, it's on their furniture. And so they changed the recipe. But in doing so, the new formula for the recipe for the chocolate coating, it no longer had the snap that when you normally bite into a chocolate covered ice cream bar, you expect a certain amount of snap. With that being changed because they wanted it to be less melty, it was now kind of soft. They actually got more complaints for the lack of a crunchy chocolate exterior than they did for the meltiness that was falling on the floor.
So wild.
And like on your clothes. Yeah. So they actually had to go back and change it because people were like, I would rather have melty ice cream that I can't eat than ice cream that does not have a crispy chocolatey outer covering.
So, I mean, it's funny, like, I mean, but it makes sense, right? Like, if your experience is with this one thing versus the other, it's hard to figure out a way to maintain both, I guess.
Absolutely. All right. Whew. We did it. We talked about crunchy food.
For a long time.
I think that we can hit some take-home points, I think, but otherwise we've more or less unpacked why we really love crunchy food. And I think it was not so obvious as just the fact that crunchy food is the best. I think there were some really useful things to add to that. For me, one of the big take-home points is the fact that our love of crunchy food is learned. It is learned quickly. It's learned at an early age, but it is learned. And it is associated with at least 4 powerful gustatory experiences that we described here, the main hypotheses, that it tells us something about the freshness of the food. It provides texture variety in our foods. It is accompanied by our expectations of what we're about to eat. And finally, it creates these sensory tapestries of having different types of food experience that can include the textures of crunch as well as the sound for those people for whom that is a relevant feature.
Yeah. One of my big take-home points is that using the biting into broken glass is a bad metaphor for talking about food in general.
Yeah.
That's not a common experience. I mean, we could probably get, surmise what that might be like, but also none of us do that. So it's a bad metaphor.
Right.
And so maybe when you're using food-related discussions, use metaphors that are more food-related. I don't know, but I also really like that it is a nuance, right? Like there's nuance related to crispiness, crunchiness, wet, dry, that is a little bit more complex than people would give it credit for. People hear crunch and they're like, oh, that's easy. But then when you really dig into it, it's like, oh, it's a little bit more complicated than we had originally discussed, And
actually following up on that, I think a take-home point for me, one that I specifically was it was something I think that I really did learn coming into this and putting together the notes for this episode was that thinking about the definition of a crunch, of the fact that you've got a certain amount of resistance that doesn't just break, but like shatters. Mm-hmm. And that's what we think of as crunch, and that there's different ways that can appear. Again, if you're eating produce, then it's essentially breaking down the cell walls of a food. I mean, if you're eating something like, if you're getting that dry crunch, then you're sort of releasing these little pockets of air that are built into these starch and protein rigid structures. I think that was kind of a neat feature of this is just describing what is crispy crunchiness, is, applying just enough force to break down the food such that it has a mini explosion.
I like that.
Which is why we like Pop Rocks.
Well, yeah, Pop Rocks are fantastic. Such a great invention. My last little take on point is that crunchy food is the best.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that we've gathered that from this episode. I don't know that there is fair. Really much more of a take-home point with that.
Right.
In Abraham's words, quote, "Crunchy peanut butter is royalty among the gods of crunchiness," end quote. Hopefully, however you're buried or leave this mortal coil on your remains or remembered, or, hopefully that's the quote that you're left with.
That was great. Thank you. And so I think that's all that I have to talk about with crunchiness. Do you have anything else?
No, I think that's all I got.
Let's get to some recommendations.
Recommendations. All right, so I am going to recommend a clothing company, and this is a clothing company that I really enjoy for several reasons. I like that it's a little bit, maybe the word is contrarian. It's a little bit in your face, but I also like the kind of the core message behind this company. And that company is called Black Craft Cult.
Okay.
Have you seen their stuff at all?
Not at all, no.
It is very, how would you describe it? Satanist?
Okay.
Not like evil, you know, like it's like traditional Satanism in terms of like the Satanic Temple and all that. So when you go on to Black Craft Cult, you'll see a lot of the clothing has like you know, like kind of witchy, kind of runes, glyphs, stuff like that. And recently I ordered a blind box. You can get a blind box of their merch, and it's like $50, and they'll send you like $150, $200 worth of merchandise. So they sent me 2 t-shirts, a pair of sweatpants, which it's the first pair of sweatpants I've ever owned, and they are the most comfortable thing on the planet.
You joined the sweatpants club.
I have recently joined the sweatpants club. A bandana, which I can't wear anywhere because it's a church on it. There's like little prints. It's a church that's on fire, and it says "Stay Lit" underneath it.
Oh no.
Yeah. So so I'm not gonna wear that anywhere. But the shirts they sent were really cool. They're really big prints, very colorful prints, very unique. But the message of the company is kind of create your own future, right? Like it's like you are in charge and responsible for yourself. So you have like, you know, kind of like very much so like hail yourself in anything. And I really like that message overall. It's very individual driven versus, you know, having some kind of outside influence on your life and well-being. So I'm going to recommend that. If you can get the blind box while it's out, please do that. They also sent me a pop socket in that, and it's a pizza cut into a pentagram.
Oh, fun.
So there you go for our Patreons who can see that.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm going to put that on my phone, and I'm going to have to hide it from all the clients I work with.
You know, if they are sending you a box of things, could it instead be create your own future instead of create your own future?
See, it could be. It should be. I'll tell them right now. They're super successful, and like a bunch of wrestlers wear their stuff, and like it's all over the place, but I'll tell them to do better.
Like, we thought of this. Why didn't you think of this?
Yeah, come on, tighten up.
Okay, I am recommending chocolate because I've been on a huge chocolate kick lately. I don't know why.
Yes.
And because we're talking about crunchy, crispy foods, and it's just seemed right. So I am recommending Trader Joe's The Dark Chocolate Lovers Chocolate Bar. And this is something that I got recently and I really, really enjoyed. So if you're into dark chocolate, I feel like you could do a lot worse than Trader Joe's Dark Chocolate Lovers Chocolate Bar.
Excellent.
And they're not expensive, like relative to other chocolate bars. They're actually fairly cheap. So I think they're only a couple bucks for a chocolate bar. Whereas you go to Whole Foods and get one of those like fancy, tiny chocolate bars, and it's like $7 for a chocolate bar.
Yeah, that's too much. That's too much.
Yeah. I'm like, what are you doing, guys? Come on. So
yeah. No thanks.
All right, that's my recommendation. That, I think, is all we have for crispy food and for recommendations. So it's time now to really think about the people who help make this podcast be a thing. And we'll start with our Patreon supporters because they're the ones who fund our daily chocolate habits. And that includes Amanda, Brad, Kathleen, the Daily BA, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kim, Kostia, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, and Shauna. Thank you all so much. You are amazing and wonderful, and we super appreciate you and your continued help.
Like so much.
So much. It's absolutely a thing. In addition, I'd like to thank my team of people who help this podcast live and breathe and wake up every morning. And that is Justin, who does our audio. Shane, thank you for recording with me today.
Of course.
And then the rest of the team, Selena, Kyle, and Alan, for all of their awesome work that they do as well. And I think that is all that I have. Is there anything I'm missing?
Nope, I think that covers it.
All right. Hope you enjoyed Women's History Month. Looking forward to Prevent Child Abuse Month and Autism Awareness Month. And go buy some merch from our store and join us on Patreon. That is all I have. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.